we've always said, if you're good enough to work here, you should be good enough to stay. If you're good enough to work here, you should receive the same treatment as anybody else in Canada. And hopefully that means minimum requirements, minimum legislation, right? It should be much more than that. But at the very least, the rights that are given to anybody else working anywhere else should be given to temporary foreign workers as well.
Welcome to Perspectives, a Canadian journal of political economy and social democracy. I'm Clement Nokos, editor of Perspectives Journal and director of policy at the Broadband Institute. After a long summer break for the Perspectives Journal podcast, we're back with the problematic temporary foreign workers program in the news once again, as well as growing anti-immigrant sentiment that we saw this summer across Canada and other Western countries. While the mainstream media casts blame on governments, there isn't much criticism being directed at the industries actually exploiting these migrant workers. Also absent from these mainstream narratives are the voices of labor and migrant workers themselves. That's why I'll be speaking with Pablo Godoy, Regional Director of Western Provinces and Emerging Sectors for the United Food and Commercial Workers Union Canada, on how the Temporary Foreign Workers Program has come to be so problematic, what needs to be done to fix Canada's immigration system, and what Labour is doing to act now while the federal government and industry sits on its hands and lets this anti-immigrant sentiment ferment. Pablo Godoy, welcome to the Perspectives Journal podcast.
Thanks for having me.
There's a lot of conversation going on these days about the Temporary Foreign Workers Program. I know from being a racialized Canadian myself that this has been a program that's been problematic for a long time. Before this Trudeau government, it was a Harper government issue. And in Canada, we're seeing this anti-immigrant sentiment growing, even paradoxically among our own multicultural communities, as sort of the scapegoats for the housing crisis, to cuts to public services. They're being used as a scapegoat for perceptions that crime is rising. And this has fueled far-right political parties. You don't just see it in Canada. You've seen these kind of riots happen in places like the UK, across Europe. You also had in the recent European elections a far-right rise and a backlash against immigration policies there. So why, in your view, is this culminating in Canada despite, we're known as a multicultural society? We previously celebrated ourselves as a country of immigrants. Why is this anti-immigrant sentiment growing now when the Temporary Foreign Workers Program has been a problem for more than a decade?
So I think we're facing an unprecedented time when it comes to the cost of living, when it comes to interest rates, when it comes to greedflation, and the price of almost everything and anything that people are trying to access has skyrocketed. As a union, we've always said the only thing that never seems to really keep up pace when things increase in cost are real wages, the amount of money that people are taking home. And so this creates a level of frustration that I think many people across Canada are facing. The problem here, though, is that we're scapegoating a group of workers that have been labeled as temporary, but that have really been a permanent staple of work or a source of labor in Canada. I always like to point to 2009 as this critical moment in time, historically speaking, with Canada's immigration system. At the time, Stephen Harper was in power. They started expanding a bunch of the temporary foreign workers. And so if you're not familiar with it, there's the temporary foreign worker program. That's the umbrella under which different programs exist and take place. That includes the seasonal agriculture worker program. It includes things like the live-in caregiver program, high-skilled, low-skilled programs. And in 2009, for the first time in Canada's history, the number of people that entered Canada temporarily, people that weren't going to have access to any form of residency or status or be able to access status, surpassed the number of people that actually were able to come in and migrate permanently or have access to residency. Why that's an important moment in time is because that signaled really the beginning of an over-reliance on temporary foreign labor versus real migration, or migration that actually has access to live and subsist and become citizens or residents of Canada. Since then, the number of temporary foreign workers has increased drastically. So too have the industries in which they work. So too has the ability and ease at which employers are able to access workers. And so we have a system where our immigration favors temporary migration, but one where employers have more power to pick and choose who comes in or who doesn't come in through these programs, which is a very dangerous reality. What I'm saying, though, is that as long as industry, and as soon as industry was given this big power to be able to pretty much bring in as many workers as they wanted to for different reasons. I would obviously contend that it's to keep costs low, it's to keep their labor costs low, it's to have a source of labor that has less rights, that isn't able to enact them, enforce them, or have any meaningful way of doing so, because that's attractive to employers, unfortunately, right? To exploit workers. But what we've done is ballooned this program to a point where the narrative is they're stealing people's jobs. They're doing the work that others can't. We're facing a moment in which Canada has one of the highest unemployment rates it's had in a while or recent history. And so that, coupled with a lot of migrant workers in Canada, or at least that being the narrative, has allowed the far right and certain groups and facets of society to take a group of workers that really are the most vulnerable workers at the end of the day. The folks that don't have access to full status, full rights, real meaningful access to enforcing any rights that they do have in place, and using them as the scapegoat as to why things cost more, why people don't have a job, why people aren't being able to survive or subsist, rather than actually paint the narrative of the truth, which would be, employers are using workers to exploit them. We know that companies are using tactics to what we would call in the labor movement greedflate, right? Greedflation, make things skyrocket in prices. And rather than actually pinpoint the reality, which is industry and government making these choices that have provided a really crummy or crappy environment for people to try to subsist, it's easier to take a xenophobic approach and have somebody to point at and be able to say, these folks that aren't from here, that don't have full status, they're the problem, they're the reason that housing is inaccessible, they're the reason things are unaffordable. And the reality is, it's not true. Not only is it not true because Canada has always depended on temporary foreign workers, but it's not true because a lot of the realities that people are facing come as a consequence of a lot of policy and decision making that has either driven these realities or allowed employers, companies, and industry to create scenarios and circumstances where things have become unaffordable, inaccessible. And that's just created this environment of frustration and anger. And so, what the right is doing very well is positioning a group of racialized, mostly folks that are under status as the reason that these realities exist.
Talking about it further, I can recall a few years ago when there were a few Jamaican agricultural workers in Southern Ontario who wrote home to their government calling their treatment as temporary foreign workers akin to systematic slavery. And I think that this latest round of criticism against the temporary foreign workers program only came about with the UN Special Rapporteur on Contemporary Slavery coming out with a report in July that called out the exploitative nature of this program. You see in the history, too, of programs like the Living Caregiver Program, which required, a massive overhaul in recent years because every time this program made headlines, it was over allegations of abuse by employers. And you also had in recent years the international student program facing similar scrutiny when it came to things like the underfunding of post-secondary education or the housing crisis. And, we are coming closer and closer to this crisis moment. But these programs, they've been existing for a long, long, long time. And if they were so problematic to begin with, why did they continue on to this current state of affairs?
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question as to why is it that we're at this place where we're shining this light on this program when the realities of these programs that are being spoken about today, merit this discussion. But unfortunately, the reality is that from their onset, these realities have been a reality, right? Like I don't know how else to say it. The Seasonal Agriculture Worker Program is a program that has been a bilateral agreement between Jamaica and Canada, Mexico and Canada, some Caribbean countries in Canada that bring in agriculture workers seasonally. They come in with contracts that range up to 8 months a year. Many workers might come up to 30 years at a time, right? So they end up being here more over a 30-year period than they are back home. And yet the reports that we've shared for the over 30 years that we've done work in this space and that we've been trying to advocate and work for and have had migrant workers support centers have been the same and have mirrored what these Jamaican workers, brave Jamaican workers, if I may say so, came together to signal to their government. We know that during COVID, the Mexican government actually stopped sending migrant workers to Canada because they said, hey, Mr. Trudeau, the circumstances and situations are not up to par for our workers to come to Canada because quite literally they're coming to Canada to work, get sick, and some unfortunately passed away. What I'm saying is that the realities that are today signaled, or that the UN rapporteur ended up citing in their report, are things that advocates have been saying from the onset, that these programs put way too much power in the hands of employers, and that creates the ability, the opportunity for unscrupulous employers to take advantage, exploit, in many different ways, their labor. And the lack of being able to create a mechanism through which workers can actually access or enforce their rights creates a scenario with a person that's under status to not be able to advocate for their own rights. And when they are, it's often easier for employers to send them home before that worker ever really is able to achieve any type of representation, put in a complaint. And often our complaint systems that exist today under the Employment Standards Act in any province really warns an employer before anything really happens anyways. And so the employer is able to pinpoint who is it that made the complaint and send workers home, right? And so there's these gaps of enforcement because these programs are able to exist in this gray space where things like housing that are up to the employers are municipal, where labor rights are provincial, where these programs operate at a federal level, sometimes at a bilateral level. And so you have this perennial passing of the buck about whose responsibility it is to take care of these workers, whose responsibility it is to address issues with bad employers. I mean, the best example I give in this scenario, over the last several years, we've been able to be successful in convincing the government to allow for more open work permits in certain circumstances. So when there's identifiable or proof that a worker has been exploited or discriminated against or abused psychologically, physically, mentally, sexually, financially. And if we're able to prove so, that employee, that worker, is able to be granted an open work permit that allows them to work in any other industry rather than the one they were specifically working in, or rather than the employer, because many programs tie you to a single employer, which gives that employer quite a lot of power in that labor relationship. But it allows you to access this open work permit and work somewhere else. Why that's key is we prove in hundreds and hundreds of cases that a worker has been exploited, abused, discriminated against in any of those 5 ways. The government accepts this proof and says, okay, you get an open work permit because you were able to prove this, but nothing happens to the employers, right? And so you're saying that I can prove to you that you have an employer that's doing X, Y, and Z, but there's no remedy sought or any action taken right away against the employers. Why I pinpoint this is to say that the employers in these systems have so much power. They're literally the ones that operate the programs in many ways as if they were immigration officers. They work directly with recruiters that may or may not have any governmental ties to Canada or the sending countries. These recruitment agencies often go to, impoverished communities where there's a drastic need economically and otherwise to find other work externally, right? I think it's important to say not all workers are here because they absolutely want to leave their countries, their families, their communities of origin, their communities of support and networks of support. What they're doing is trying to help their families subsist back home, quite frankly, in a place that allows them to make maybe a little bit more money. But these recruiters go into these spaces looking for vulnerable programs. These programs are set up quite purposefully to look for vulnerable people. So for many years, the seasonal agriculture worker program, for instance, or the living caregiver program, for instance, was looking specifically for people that had a lower level of education, that had family ties, that had families, perhaps kids that were married, right? These are requisites for these programs because the idea was that way these workers won't want to stay here. They'll send their remittances back home. And it creates another level of vulnerability and precarity when you know that what you're trying to do is help your family subsist, that you'll be able to accept more of the circumstances that you may face here in Canada. Now, why it's important is because most workers come here already, not most, but many come with some level of debt because they've paid a recruiter, which is supposed to be illegal in these programs. But you'll land in Canada with a debt. Now you have one job, you're tied to a single employer. You're left with a position that says, if I want to uplift my family back home, I either have to confront and maybe make do with whatever circumstances I have. And so it's this luck of the draw situation where you might have an okay employer, somebody that may respect the law, or you don't. And then you're faced with this really difficult, extreme decision of how you navigate that situation. I mean, the problem is we've allowed these industries to balloon. The amount of workers each company is able to access has only increased over the years. The ability or the threshold to prove that you need migrant workers or that you have a labor shortage has actually decreased as well. And so all those things are policy decisions that ultimately have allowed this program to expand, to explode to a point where we're now saying, hey, there's way too many people here. And the narrative shouldn't be that. It should be that we've allowed and handed the keys to a system to folks that should have never had the keys. These programs that when they are spoken about, when they are critiqued, when they are examined, there is a lack of labor voices in that space. And that is the biggest problem here, is that you keep making policy changes without hearing the voices of workers or the impact that these changes will have on workers. And so I mean, the last point I'll make on that is that last year was the first time ever that the voice of labor was present at the Seasonal Agricultural Workers Program evaluation meeting that happens every single year since 1967. For the first time was a voice of labor. And we weren't invited by the Canadian government. It's important to say. We've done a lot of work in Mexico, and it was the Mexican government that invited UFCW Canada to speak on behalf of what they've seen and what they've heard over the 30 years of our work, right? If that's not alarming, that our own country that speaks to wanting to make reforms and better situations isn't doing so, right? I think it proves to me, in my mind at least, that industry is allowed to be there, lobbying groups are allowed to be there, the agricultural associations allowed to be there, but not the voice of workers. For me, there's not any more violent signal that says what's important to the government and in policy making when it comes to immigration and temporary foreign worker programs is what industry needs and wants, not how people feel, not on what the impact is on society, and not what advocates are saying.
Yeah, that narrative that you hear from the mainstream media and pundits, I've never heard myself a racialized immigrant and or foreign worker or member of the labor movement talk about and criticize the immigration programs that Canada maintains. But what else are the mainstream press getting wrong about the temporary foreign workers program in the current iteration of it? Because absent these voices, they're going to obviously have a skewed view. But can you tell us more about what you think they're getting wrong in the current mainstream narrative?
Well, I'd say there's a couple of things. The first thing is the push-pull factors that push people away from their countries are often being created by Canada itself or Canadian companies, right? A good example is our mining and extraction practices in Central and South America, where quite literally you're going into mostly and most often indigenous territories, quite literally claiming ownership over land that has been ancestral lands for thousands, if not tens of thousands of years, pushing people off their lands, and then creating quote unquote opportunities for people to come to Canada under temporary foreign worker programs when they are displaced, right? And a great example of that is the Canadian Mining Corporation in Guatemala, where I'm from, where that was quite literally what was done. You extracted and removed people from their lands and then said, well, as a consequence, we can get some of you into this temporary foreign worker program and you can go to Leamington and pick tomatoes, right? So we're creating the push factors. Then we create the pull factors of the same workers that end up coming here, getting blamed for this lack of jobs or opportunities or prosperity for everybody else. And I think that's a narrative that's really missing, because often our own practices, whether it's through free trade agreements or whether it's through extractionism that we're heavily involved with, in at least as Canadian companies abroad, we're missing the picture on why folks are being pushed out of their countries and why they're being pulled here, right? Like, we're creating the problem and then trying to create the solution. And all along, we're taking advantage of the resources, the human beings, the people along the entire migration system. I also think that there's a narrative of, and I think it's a xenophobic narrative, that everybody leaves their country because they want to come to Canada, work here and live here. And like, I like Canada. Sure, we have great things here, and a lot of people may want to stay here. But that's not the absolute truth. People are being pushed away because they want better opportunities for their families, perhaps to make a little bit more money, to be able to put their kids through school, to be able to subsist. And that, if you speak to many workers, they'll tell you some may have interest to stay here, but others don't, right? There's just an opportunity being created that often is a bigger, better perception before they come here. So they're being sold this idea of what they'll have when they get here. A lot of workers have told us about the dream that they're sold, this opportunity to make a lot more money than they end up making, this opportunity to do different work than they end up having to do, right? And so people are being oversold these opportunities in Canada, coming to meet and see a different reality than what they were originally offered. And so I think one of the key elements that's missed is also the vulnerability that some workers come here with, but also the actually aggressive approach to wanting to recruit folks and sell them on these ideas is something that Canada's complicit in. It's something that industry is being allowed to do. And so it's not this worker that is sitting in a different country saying, I'd love to take some Canadian's job, right? That is not the narrative. And it's not something that's often talked about. Why is it that workers get here to Canada? How is it they're actually getting here? And then what circumstances are they actually facing? And when situations are bad, what is being done, right? It's unfortunate that the conversation around migrant workers today is not about their living conditions, their working conditions, how they've been abused historically, how they're repatriated before they're able to access rights, how they're banned to join a union in certain provinces, right? These are quite literal violences against mostly racialized folks who are forced to do things like pay into employment insurance, but are legislated out of ever being able to receive that benefit. And rather than the media say, actually, temporary foreign workers come and contribute quite significantly to our social welfare safety nets, like Canadian pension, like employment insurance, and seldom, if ever, receive any of that benefit, they're actually doing quite a huge favor in that case to the rest of society in terms of contributing to these systems that they're either banned legislatively out of receiving, or simply because they're not informed, told, or that government really doesn't pay enough attention to want to actually help them access. So there's a couple of narratives here that are missing. One, the reason they get here isn't necessarily because they wake up one day and say, I'd like to go to Canada to take somebody else's job. Two, that they're being sold on these ideas of coming to Canada and having access to status, even though upon arrival they realize they're not. Three, the circumstances at work and living conditions aren't really being spoken about. The power the industry has gained in this space to really amplify the numbers or be able to exploit or be able to repatriate and really act like there's really nobody to be accountable to is problematic. And then finally, the contribution they make to Canada and have made historically is something it's often ignored and never spoken about, right? Ultimately, our agricultural system, the backbone of agriculture in Canada, has been migrant labor. When we look at a lot of our infrastructure, has relied a lot on living caregivers, on construction workers, on healthcare workers that have come from abroad to contribute significantly in times of need to Canada. And that narrative is often lost, and I think it's purposeful, right? Because you won't be able to scapegoat a group if you're thanking them for all the work and contributions that they've done to our systems. And so, I think there's a lot of nuances there that the media misses, and it's unfortunate because rather than speak to, the bigger problems at hand, it's easier to pinpoint or put people against each other, which is, I think, a very capitalist mindset, right? As long as people are distracted with fighting each other, they won't want to or identify the person that they should be fighting against, which is often the folks that have the power and decision-making power.
And so, Pablo, you work to empower migrant workers through your work with UFCW Canada. Could you tell us more about the exact work that you do and what labor unions and the movement in general are doing to defend the rights of workers caught up in these exploitative schemes? Like, what more needs to be done?
Yeah, so I think there's a large movement of organizations that are nonprofit, civil organizations, and unions that are spending a lot of time or have historically done a lot of work to try to advocate, protect, in some cases represent migrant workers. We at UFCW Canada, at our peak, were operating 10 migrant worker support centers where workers across Canada come to our centers and receive free services that ranged anywhere from ESL to crisis intervention, to labor rights issues, to unionization, to healthcare clinics. We know that often workers are quite literally stripped of their identification when they land. So they might be stripped of their passports, their driver's license, any identifiers, which make it difficult to access social services. And so our centers would help provide access to those type of services. In addition to that, we've tried to, along the years, enact or take up any legislative battles that we could. So in Ontario, for example, the agriculture workers are banned from joining a union. And so we took that legislative bill or reality to task. We took it to the Supreme Court of Canada to try to overturn that reality that all workers should be, have their constitutional right to be able to join a union and associate for collective bargaining agreement. So we've levied a lot of legal battles here in Canada, but also abroad where workers have been exploited, where there's been international organizations that do migration. For example, there was one by the name of the OIM in Guatemala that was charging all Guatemalan workers a certain fee just to apply to be a migrant worker. So we levied a case against them so that they ended up stopping that fee. We do a lot of advocacy, obviously. So we do lobbying to change the rules and regulations to provide better access to citizenship for workers, better access to rights and regulations and enforcement mechanisms. We were able to help create the agri-food pilot with the federal government that provided 2,500 new spaces a year for workers to apply directly to citizenship if they've achieved 2 years of work under the temporary foreign worker program. So we keep chipping at it. And the problem here is, and I guess the challenge is that we have to go at it in so many different ways, in so many different spaces, because there's the legislative piece, there's the on-the-ground reality of how workers are being treated every single day that we know that no matter how much we push legislatively may not actually affect or impact the realities that workers face on the grounds. It's the reason why unions exist, right? You can have very nice laws in paper, but we know that employers still continue to exploit and mistreat their workers. We've also been very successful with actually our work in Mexico, where we've been able to create programs where we're able to get people the information before they get to Canada. One of the biggest pieces here, I think, is people land in Canada to do work and are unaware of where to get help, what their rights are when they land, what benefits are they're entitled to by being part of these programs and working in Canada. And so now we're able to do some of this work in Guatemala and in Mexico and then try to empower workers that way. So at least they land in Canada prepared. The other piece here, though, is that we've done what we've traditionally done, which is try to unionize workers across Canada in the spaces and places where they're able to. Most recently, we were able to be successful organizing a mushroom facility in BC that has more than 430 workers across 5 facilities. More than 60% of them are migrant workers from Mexico and Guatemala that were facing some difficult working conditions. And what's important when we've been able to organize folks in a traditional sense is that we're able to ensure that they get the protections that any other worker in Canada would receive. We're able to ensure that whether you're full status and Canadian or you're a migrant worker that's under status, you're able to get the same level of wages, benefits, and enjoy the realities of being unionized, which is actually having a representation in your workplace. What that's led to as well are thousands of folks today that have achieved full citizenship because we were able to negotiate in our collective bargaining agreements access to status. So in places like Alberta, in BC, in Manitoba, we have either tripartite agreements with the provincial government and the employer or directly in our collective bargaining agreements that if an employee chooses to stay and wants to apply for residency, the employer is obligated to support them in that process so that they're able to achieve status. And so for us, that's one of the biggest victories that we can ever share, and the successes of unionizing, in that the power of having a collective bargaining agreement has been able to circumvent some of the barriers, some of the traditional difficulties that workers face in actually being able to achieve status, and in a way where the employer can't use it as a perennial carrot to dangle in front of employees, because that often was something that we see, which is an employer that knows that it has the power to either sponsor or negate a person's ability to stay, gives an extreme amount of power to that employer. And so we've been able to achieve that in many spaces as well. We continue to do our mobile advocacy, our mobile centers are operative across Canada, where we continue to provide the same types of support, but there's so much needed. There's so many workers in so many places, and the type of work is often difficult to access workers. So they're working in the homes, quite literally, of folks in the live-in caregiver example. They're living in remote areas in the agricultural system. And so you might find them so dispersed in so many places right across Canada. And so organizing them, supporting workers in a tangible, real way can become challenging and difficult just because of their disparity, the dispersed nature, I should say, and the type of work that they do. Having said that, though, we continue to do this work and we'll continue to push the government because there's still more reforms that are needed. And the reforms that are needed have to be based on the feedback and input and realities that workers are facing, not the asks of industry.
Immigration is clearly a labor issue, and it sounds to me like labor is leading the charge against these corporate entities and industry. Though labor has been absent from the mainstream narrative, I think labor has been punching above its weight in this field. But for a lot of the mainstream narrative, a lot of the blame goes back to the federal government. Change this policy, change that policy. From labor's perspective, what's one big policy change the government needs to implement to end this contemporary form of slavery?
Our biggest ask would be that representation is an aspect of these programs the moment people land. So that if a worker gets to Canada and has any type of issue, they have someone, and whether it's an office, whether it's a ombudsman, whether there's some type of ministry created. We would argue the best form of representation is allow them to have access to union representation upon landing to help them make sure that their working conditions, living conditions, and their overall time in Canada is one that's had with dignity and respect in mind. I think that's a good policy start. The second policy ask has always been that workers should land with open work permits, irrespective of the type of industry they come to work in. At the very least, an industry-specific contract or work permit so that they can navigate or leave workplaces when they are mistreated. They can't be stuck and tied to a single employer and it be the luck of the draw situation. I think the third policy change is that employers that are found to exploit workers need to face better and stronger reprimands from government. That should be losing access to temporary foreign workers. It should be a bigger fines. It should be shutting them down, right? If people are dying in your workplace, literally because of their working and living conditions, you should not be operative as a company. I think that's plain and simple, right? I think we also need further access to pathways to citizenship. So we need to be able to understand that what we need to do is move temporary foreign workers that don't have access to residency or status to move them into a stream where they do have access, because what you've created otherwise is a system where you clearly have indicated who you'd like to stay. And those often end up being economic, folks with money, folks with certain countries. And I would say if you do a further analysis, you'd probably see that there's definitely a racial inclination, gendered inclination to who it is that you'd like to stay and those that can't. And most of those under the temporary foreign worker programs are banned from staying. And so we need to find a way to move those folks into the stream that allow them to stay. Because again, where we started today's conversation is these temporary foreign workers are treated as temporary, and it says it in the name, but we know that they've been a permanent staple. We have examples where we have these tripartite agreements that I spoke about where we're able to help folks achieve their status and their citizenship. And what we found is when we're able to do so, workers don't leave those workplaces. In fact, quite the opposite. They're happy to stay at a workplace that has helped them achieve status, that pays them well, that treats them well. And so if we're able to do that, more folks will do the same. And so those are some quite quick hitting ones, but we need to ban recruitment agencies. We need to stop the over-reliance on recruitment agencies that aren't accountable to any governments. We need to make sure that corporations that are asking for temporary foreign workers are setting up circumstances well. We know that inspection agencies can't keep up with the demand, right? It was estimated that there was tens of thousands of farms in Ontario alone and only 3 or 4 folks to investigate or actually go see the farms. And so we have a mismatch of how these programs operate versus how they're actually being monitored. And until that's fixed, there is no hope in sight, unfortunately, because you can't even catch up to the place you need to be simply on inspection levels, let alone on actually doing something when there's mistreatment. And so there is a robust overchange that's needed, but those are some quick things that could be done immediately. And we've maintained, hey, if you want somebody to do so, UFCW, or I'm sure unions and other industries will be happy to play the representation space just to make sure that workers at the very least are being treated at the very least. And this is so important to say, with the minimum requirements of employers, right? We're left fighting for the ability to ensure that workers receive the least amount possible that an employer is supposed to provide for them, right? And obviously we want so much more, but my point is it's difficult to even ensure that workers receive the minimum requirements. And in that space where you have so many workers that come here yearly, where you have so little inspection or monitoring agents, we need a better solution to make sure folks are being treated correctly. Lastly, we've always said, if you're good enough to work here, you should be good enough to stay. If you're good enough to work here, you should receive the same treatment as anybody else in Canada. And hopefully that means minimum requirements, minimum legislation, right? It should be much more than that. But at the very least, the rights that are given to anybody else working anywhere else should be given to temporary foreign workers as well.
Pablo Godoy, thank you very much for all that you do. And thank you for joining me today on the Perspectives Journal podcast.
I appreciate it. Thanks for having me and for speaking about such an important issue.
That was Pablo Godoy, Regional Director of Western Provinces and Emerging Sectors for the United Food and Commercial Workers Union Canada. And if you like this interview, share and subscribe to Perspectives, a journal of Canadian political economy and social democracy on all major podcast platforms, as well as Press Progress's Sources podcast that digs deeper into the news stories you won't find in the major papers. The Perspectives Journal podcast and Sources are proud members of the Harbinger Media Network, Canada's progressive podcast community. You can read more in Perspectives Journal, a publication of the Broadbent Institute, by visiting perspectivesjournal.ca.